You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Welcome back to Sweet Talk, recording from our sugar house at the Cornell Eline Forest in the Adirondacks. I'm Adam Wild, and joining me from the Arnott Forest is my colleague and co-host Aaron Whiteman. Hello, Aaron.
Hi, Adam. It's great to be back in the studio.
So in our last episode, our guest was Dr. Navindra Seeram, who shared with us his research findings into the potential health benefits of maple syrup. We left off discussing the difficulties of testing these health benefits within human subjects. So to follow up on this, our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Tremblay, who was the first to research potential health benefits of maple on humans. And he did this by looking at the potential of maple as a sports drink in comparison to commercial sports drinks.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So I compete in ultramarathons and other endurance sports, and it's important to have a quality sugar source to provide quick energy during those types of events. And maple does seem like a logical option. But the Cornell Maple program, we've actually been experimenting with maple sports drinks. And so I'm excited to hear how maple performed against commercial sports drinks.
Yeah, maple is a great alternative energy source for athletes. And as we discussed in our last episode of Sweet Talk, maple is a smarter sweetener. So it will be interesting to hear Dr. Tremblay's take on this. Dr. Jonathan Tremblay is an associate professor of kinesiology and human kinetics at the University of Montreal. Hello, Dr. Tremblay. Welcome to Sweet Talk.
Hi, Adam. Nice to meet you.
It's great to talk with you. I'm really excited to learn how you are incorporating maple syrup into your research field. But before we get into that, I want to ask, what is kinesiology and human kinetics?
So kinesiology and human kinetics, or sometimes we call it exercise science, encompasses all the sciences that pertain to exercise. So how exercise can be used therapeutically, how we can understand the body through exercise as a stressor, and how we can understand exercise performance and the limits of human performance in general. My expertise is in exercise physiology. So understanding how the body works and the different systems, how they interact together during exercise in order to produce a response that allows us to better perform or to adapt to the stressor, which is exercise or the environment that surrounds us.
Neat, very neat. So what is your kind of specific specialty within that field?
So in exercise physiology, I'm specialized in what we call sometimes integrative exercise physiology. So integrating the different systems in whole body exercise. And what my research has mainly focused on whole body exercise that extends more than a few minutes. So it's not just powerful exercise, but more like either intermittent exercise that's repeated over many minutes, over a full session, or continuous exercise that can be accustomed to cycling or running or walking for long periods of time. And through this, my expertise is mostly around exercise metabolism. So how your body uses different fuels to produce energy or converts those energetic fuels in order to produce mechanical energy, mechanical power.
Neat. So I did college sports, and I wouldn't consider myself an elite athlete by any means, but I know that elite athletes are typically extremely disciplined with their diet and the workout routine. So with this in mind, why are you interested in researching maple syrup as an athlete supplement?
Well, the idea first came about because, so in some cycling races and running races in Quebec anyway, some people were already taking maple syrup by themselves, as a fuel, as a sugar that they can use. So we know for many years now, for more than, I'd say 50 years, about 50 years, we've known that carbohydrates are the main source of energy during exercise that extends for more than 30 to 60 minutes. So it's the main source of energy. And the more you can absorb additional carbohydrates, the better in general you have fuels. And the more fuels you have, the better you can perform. And so the idea, a lot of people, or a lot of athletes, recreational athletes mostly, were already taking maple syrup as a fuel during their endurance race. And the maple syrup producers came up to me and said, since I did research on using carbohydrates, exogenous, we call them exogenous because they come from outside the body, fuels during exercise, and to try to quantify how they can contribute to performance. So yeah, the maple syrup producers of Quebec came to me and said, could we set up a research protocol that would be able to show that maple syrup can be used during exercise and that it can compare to other different sources of carbohydrates that are available on the market and how it compares.
Oh, neat. So with those research trials that you've done using maple syrup, in comparison to those sports drinks that are on the commercial market. Can you explain a little bit more then about the research design and then the outcomes?
Yeah, so the research design, it was the first time that the maple syrup producers were involved with a research team to do clinical research with humans. And so we went back and forth and trying to figure out what protocol we could do that would satisfy their needs and actually get enough statistical power for us to reach the claims that they ideally would have wanted us to reach. So we built a protocol where we recruited about 75 subjects per study. So we did two studies. One first study where we looked at prolonged exercise, so sustained exercise at about, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but about 60% of your maximum power output that you could sustain aerobically. So we call that VO2 max. So 60% of your VO2 max. So 2 hours of exercise at that intensity and followed up by a time trial where we would test performance. And during this 2 hours of exercise, you would ingest one of 5 beverage conditions. So the 5 beverage conditions are, one is a placebo. So it's just water and sweet taste, which is stevia. It doesn't contribute any energy. One was glucose, so just pure glucose, because it's the standard exercise research. We had one commercial drink, as is, and we had 2 maple conditions. So we had maple syrup, which was diluted because maple syrup is too concentrated. And we had maple sap or maple water that we concentrated. So all the different solutions, except the placebo, which is water, had the exact same concentration of carbohydrates, which was 6% carbohydrate per volume, or 60 gram per liter approximately, which is the recommendation by the American College of Sports Medicine for ingesting carbohydrates during prolonged exercise. So this was the first study, and we looked at how these fuels were used during exercise and how they affected performance. The second study was more on intermittent exercise, so looking at repeated sprints of 3 minutes at 95% of your maximum. And so those were pretty exhaustive. And during the breaks that you had in between the sprints, you would have a cognitive task where you would have to do a task that's called the Stroop test, which is a cognitive test that assesses decision-making skills. So we were looking at cognitive flexibility, and we're looking at how maple products compare to other sources of carbohydrates, because again, carbohydrates are known to help cognitive function during difficult exercise. And so we were looking at how maple products compare to other products during that time. And so we had this cognitive test that was a computerized test that was done on the bike by the participants during the breaks. And also we were looking at the brain oxygenation through the frontal cortex during the exercise and the breaks to look at, is there a difference in the way the frontal cortex is being oxygenated, or how the blood supply is helping out maybe the cognitive function during that period. So long story short, we did 2 studies and all comparing the exact same beverage conditions, but in 2 different exercise modalities to see how maple syrup or maple sap would compare to classic conditions of just glucose, commercial drink, or a placebo.
So pretty extensive work and measuring a lot of unique output of those athletes. And so from looking at that research trial, what was the results that you saw?
So there was a lot of results. So because I didn't say everything in there, because there was a lot of measurements. So we used a technique that's called indirect respiratory calorimetry that allows us to measure expired gases and compute the fuel selection, so that to know exactly how much carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins you're using during exercise. And in addition to that, I used stable isotope tracers of carbon that I added into each of the drinks. So these are small, tiny amounts of carbon-13 that are very safe. They're non-radioactive, so there's no risk for the participants at all. They're abundant in nature, so they're about 1% in nature. We just add a bit more, about 1.1% in what they drink. And then that allowed us to trace back the carbohydrates they were using from the drink and compare that with the carbohydrates that they were using from their body. So from the liver production of glucose and from the muscle glycogen that they were using, the sugars that are stored in the muscle. And so that was fairly interesting to see how maple products could actually compare with other sources of carbohydrates and see how it would affect the endogenous fuels that are selected at the same time. And throughout the study, we also measured perceptions, so sensations of the participants with regard to the drinks. So how the drinks would affect their sense of effort, for example, or the perception of effort, how the drinks would affect perception of taste, acid taste, sweet taste, refreshing taste, and how they appreciated that taste. Because a lot of the comments we had beforehand by maple syrup users was that they like the taste. And so that was an incentive for us to actually measure that and try to see, could it contribute to an increase in performance? Because we know that some areas of the brain actually use this information to help in producing power output or helping in performance during exercise. And the last bit that we measured also was there any gastrointestinal distress during exercise? Because when you ingest carbohydrates, especially in high doses, some types of carbohydrates produce more gastrointestinal distress. So we wanted to see, is there a difference with maple syrup than with the other carbohydrates? So this was only for the first study. And we also reported on glycemia, the different blood measurements that we could see how the response physiologically would look like. And the main finding is that, well, pretty much maple syrup and maple sap or maple water are, when they contain the same amount of carbohydrates as other carbohydrate sources, we see pretty much the same results. They're absorbed as well as glucose or a commercial sports drink, and they can contribute to performance the same way as a commercial sports drink or regular glucose.
Yeah, so kind of an equal comparison, but the maple syrup did not necessarily show better performance or better cognitive results or anything like that, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the hypothesis was that we could possibly see better results because maple syrup is kind of unique in the sense that 98% of the sugar is sucrose. And sucrose is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose that is better absorbed in the gut than just glucose or just fructose, for example, because you can use multiple transporters in the gut to absorb these carbohydrates. And so the hypothesis was that by using sucrose, we would have less of a plateau in absorption and oxidation, and it could contribute a bit more maybe to the performance. But the thing is, the dose we gave was based on the recommendations. It was the first study, and we just see similar results to other studies. But we know that with sucrose and these mixed or multiple transportable carbohydrates, we can actually give a higher dose, and the higher dose could actually lead to better oxidation and utilization during exercise. So that's what we actually plan to do in future studies, is actually look at the dose response with maple syrup and see, is there a greater benefit of using a higher dose with maple syrup than just the regular dose that we gave already.
So in the commercial sports drinks that are on the market, what's the form of sugar? Is that glucose, fructose? Or
It's actually, it depends on the commercial sports drink, but most of the commercial sports drink now use a combination of glucose, fructose, sucrose, some maltodextrin, which is a polymer, and sometimes additional products and electrolytes. So there's a bunch of different things, and they taste different as well. So maple products is interesting because in our test solution, we only use maple syrup. So there's nothing else, just water to dilute it. So that was it. And we saw comparable results. And even when you look at the sensory perception, some athletes actually preferred the taste because it was less acid than the commercial products. And so that's interesting. So it goes to recommend maybe to some people to try out, different beverages. And if you prefer to have something that's completely natural, like you make yourself at home and you like the taste, well, go for it, because you could perform probably similarly with maple products than you can with the commercial products.
Yeah, that's neat. That's what I was kind of thinking, that so it's not necessarily, maple syrup's not going to be necessarily better, but it's comparable. And I think as maple producers, if we're trying to market that, we can market the story, right, of that this is this more natural product. You can make it yourself. You're not having all these other things added in.
Exactly. And, depending on your source of maple syrup, it can be costly sometimes to make a beverage like this, but some commercial products are not cheap as well, so, and you can have something that tastes good, and you can maybe add a bit of electrolytes yourself if you want. that could contribute to better performance. Maybe if you're on a hot day, for example, and you're going to sweat a lot. But otherwise, the carbohydrates in maple syrup are very interesting for performance and for exercise. That's for sure.
Well, that was another question that I had. Speaking of the electrolytes, and that, maple syrup, are there some electrolytes or other compounds that are in maple syrup that are maybe some benefits that, those sports drinks are adding electrolytes as well? Are the other things in there that may help also?
Yeah, there are naturally, there are some electrolytes in maple syrup. But the thing is, if you take pure maple syrup, you have too much carbohydrates in there. So you have to dilute it in order to absorb it properly. And when you dilute the maple syrup, that's when you lose a bit of the electrolytes. And that's why you could add a bit of electrolytes to increase the content of electrolytes and relative to the carbohydrates in order to benefit from those if you're in a hot day and losing a lot of water. Yeah, so that's the only thing. And the other, when you use maple sap or maple water, you concentrate it, but you don't have the same electrolyte content as well. So you need to add a bit more in order to compare with the commercial sports drinks. You need to add a bit of electrolytes in there.
Okay, good to know that. What about using maple syrup more as the sports gel? So there's the commercial sports gels that are the quick kind of sugar rush. And within the Cornell Maple program, we've worked with our food science program at Cornell to develop kind of a maple sports gel and adding some protein into there as well. So are there similar things? You mentioned that it's harder to absorb the carbohydrates when it's, pure maple syrup.
When you're exercising, especially because when you're exercising, absorption is reduced because, the blood is not going through your gut as much because you're going to the muscle, right? But when you're resting after exercise or during breaks, for example, it's different. So if you're using a gel like this for recovery after exercise or between exercise bouts, it could be interesting to use a gel like this because it won't be absorbed as fast, but you have time, right? You have time to use more carbohydrates and store it and eventually regenerate some of the glycogen you lost or you used during exercise. And the protein could be beneficial especially after extensive exercise where there's been maybe a bit of muscle damage. But if you're doing endurance sports, the main source of energy you're using is glycogen. And so that's the carbohydrates are the main source that you need to replenish after exercise.
Wow, it's a lot of neat information that I think we don't typically hear within the maple world.
No, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, but it's great. It's great to hear that, and I think ways that can help the maple producers and help market to different area. I want to go back to something you had touched on earlier about human clinical trials and that, and speaking with when I spoke with Dr. Navindra Seeram, who's been studying these health benefits of maple products, but he had mentioned the difficulty of the high cost of human clinicals. And you mentioned that this was some of the first human clinical studies with maple syrup. So can you shed some light on the difficulties of working with human trials? Because that's what, the maple industry, we're kind of lacking or behind in some of that when it comes to health aspects. And so where do you see the future research of the health benefits of maple heading?
Well, I think it just working with humans in general is difficult because, there's a lot of variability between different individuals. And that variability, you have to compensate by having a large number of participants. So human population, for us, for example, when we were trying to recruit, to have 75 participants, there are different fitness levels. So we had to try to find some homogeneous sample where, our participants were somewhat fit, but not too fit. We didn't want them to be super athletes because they would behave completely differently than the regular population. And we didn't want to have people that were unfit that could not sustain 2 hours of exercise and do a time trial after that. So it's hard to find these people. When we do clinical trials as well, like this on an exercise metabolism, for us, we have to decide, do we include women or just men? And women, I've published a study a few years back that has shown that when we look at the metabolism of men and women, there's a difference in basic metabolism during exercise because women typically use a bit less carbohydrates. And especially if they use oral contraceptives, for example, there's an effect on the use of these fuels. So in order to have less variability, less variation, we needed to select men only for that study in order to reduce cost. And so there's a lot of arguments like this that make it really hard to do these studies. And for example, when we do these studies on exercise, we put them all, I said earlier, at 60% of their maximum power output or VO2 max, approximately. And in order to do that, we need to measure your VO2 max or your maximum power output. And when you come in and do studies like this, typically, if we want you to try, for example, all the 5 conditions, all the 5 beverage conditions for single participants, that would have been the best design possible, to repeat and measure design where we would have the same participants repeat with all the different conditions. But the problem is when you do this fitness test, if you don't exercise the same in the following weeks, you lose fitness. So, that same 60% of your maximum might not be the same 3 weeks later when you come back to do the study. And scheduling, with these participants that are students that work is sometimes hard. So yeah, clinical studies, I guess, there's constraints in all studies, I believe, whether it's, with forest trees or with animals, there's always constraints. But I guess the clinical studies require a bit more constraint because they're humans and we need to protect the humans. We need to make sure that we're safe. We need to make sure that, ethically that we're safe as well, that we're not using these people, for no good reason. And so that's, I guess, some of the reasons that clinical trials are hard. But it doesn't mean that we can't do them. There's a lot of clinical trials and with different products on the market. And I know that some colleagues at the University of Laval in Quebec City have done some clinical trials now and are hoping to publish soon on maple syrup, not in exercise, but on patients. But we're some of the few beginners with clinical trials with maple syrup, I guess.
Yeah, well, we appreciate your groundbreaking work that you're doing and blazing that trail. Is there any work that you're conducting right now or you're going to be doing in the near future that you would like to share that ties in with maple?
Yeah, well, with maple, some of the ideas that we're exploring now is, and it's not yet funded, but we're working on a grant application. So looks at, since we know now that maple syrup can be comparable to other sources of carbohydrates during exercise with the recommended dose of 60 grams per liter, we would like to know, do we get better or greater benefits by using a higher dose or a greater dose? So we want to look at a dose response study and we want to change the design where we have the same participants do all the doses so we can have more statistical power to explore that idea. So that's one study we're planning. And another study we're planning is that with regard to the psychological or mental aspect of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise, we want to look at, can it help sustain or alleviate the mental fatigue that we have during prolonged exercise? So I'm collaborating with a colleague in my department at University of Montreal that is specialized on the psychobiological response to exercise and the effect of mental training or mental endurance training on exercise performance. And we want to see, does maple syrup improve that mental performance during strenuous exercise?
Wow, that's really interesting. So I definitely look forward to hearing more of the results of those studies when it comes forward in the near future.
Sure.
We've hit on this a little bit, but I want to kind of wrap up with what final recommendations do you have for maple producers in the maple industry to market the health benefits of maple products to the average athlete or elite athletes?
Yeah, well, I guess some of the main arguments is that maple syrup can be used as a good energy source during exercise, endurance exercise and intermittent exercise. The taste is somewhat a bit less acid, so some can prefer the taste of maple syrup. So you have to try it out and see for yourself. There's no adverse effect on perceived exertion or gastrointestinal distress during exercise. So that's also beneficial. And we know that maple syrup can also contribute to brain executive functions or decision-making skills. And so that can also, serve as an argument to say that as other forms of carbohydrate, it's comparable. And if you like maple syrup, then go for it. It's a natural sugar that you can make an energy drink yourself at home.
Thanks for being on Sweet Talk, Dr. Tremblay. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and hear a little bit more about your research.
No problem. Good luck with the podcast.
Wow, Aaron, that was a lot to think about. Research on human subjects is complex and there are so many parameters to consider. Learning how our bodies process sugars is really fascinating. So, Aaron, what was your takeaway from the discussion?
Clearly, there's a lot more work to be done on this subject, but the results look promising so far.
So, from these results, did any of his research answer any questions or support your work with the maple sports drinks?
Yes, Dr. Tremblay's results so far show that maple has the right nutritional characteristics and flavor for these types of products, so we'll continue our work in this area. And in the meantime, listeners can track our progress on the new product development page at cornellmaple.com.
For sure. Sounds like something that we need to follow up with on a future episode. Join us next time for another episode of Sweet Talk to hear the latest information from the maple industry. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible from funding from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. All music was obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Join us next time for more Maple Sweet Talk. Have a sweet day.